Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the public lecture of the third Triggs International Premium Vinifera lecture series. My name is Isabelle Lescharz, and I'm the director of the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute at Brock University, and I will be your host for the first part of the evening. So please sit back, relax, and please switch off your cell phone. All right. Otherwise, the penalty is to give $500 to the Brock Scholarship Fund, so we will track the offenders. First, I would like to invite Dr. Jack Stone, the President and Vice Chancellor of Brock University, should I say the new President and Vice Chancellor of Brock University, to make the opening remarks. Dr. Lightstone?
Good evening. The pleasurable task falls to me to welcome you to Brock University and to this lecture series so generously sponsored by Dawn and Elaine Triggs. Il me fait grand plaisir au nom de l'Université Brock de vous accueillir ce soir à cet événement commandité par Dawn et Elaine Triggs. A bit about Brock University, as I'm learning myself, being you. Brock has grown tremendously over the past few years. That might be evident to you in terms of numbers and the footprint of the campus. But it's grown in ways that are not as clearly visible as numbers of students and the footprint of buildings. Over the past few years, you may not know, Brock has nearly doubled the number of full-time faculty at this university. At the same time, it has increased the number of graduate programs at this institution by tenfold. And it has increased the amount of funded research by about fourfold. And Brock continues to continue on this trajectory. As Brock does this, Brock is ever more firmly committed to having a positive impact and a close relationship with the community of which it is a part, the Niagara community. COVI, the Cool Climate Oenology and Viticulture Institute, is perhaps a paradigmatic example of what Brock means to be in this community, in Canada, and in the world. It has educated many highly qualified persons for the grape growing and vintners and winemakers industry. Those people are now in the community here and elsewhere around the world. The same is true of the research that is done at COVI. It too has a direct impact both in the Niagara region and increasingly through partnerships around the world with improving the quality of grape growing and of winemaking elsewhere as well. And we're committed to having an ever deeper partnership with the community, contributing with them, listening to them, and trying to serve their needs. And I think the Brock of the future will, even more so than in the past, be a partner and driving force in the cultural, social, and economic welfare of this region, and through COVI, a partner and contributor to the development of the grape growing and wine industry here in Niagara. And so, again, on behalf of Brock, I welcome everyone here this evening.
Several housekeeping information before we start. The session tonight is audio and video recorded. That's why you have to pass the microphone, because this microphone records the audio. And the record will be available on COVI website in the coming few days. So if some people who didn't have the chance to come tonight, the event will be available on the website. After the lecture and the question-answer session, we will invite you for a wine reception in the mezzanine, sponsored by Jackson Triggs Niagara Estate Winery. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Brock University has launched in 2004 this annual lecture series intended to attract and showcase world leaders in the cultivation of premium vinifera grapes, thanks to the, as Dr. Lightstone said, thanks to the generous donation by Dawn and Elaine Triggs to the university's Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute, best known as COVI. Unfortunately, this year, Don and Elaine are not able to be with us. They are actually en route to Egypt and to the Nile for a nice cruise, I believe. So, however, they sent their best wishes for another successful lecture series events. The series held at the university provide those interested in or directly involved in the business of grape growing or winemaking, as well as Brock students and faculty, with access to the most current developments in viticulture. For the first lecture series, Pascal Marchand shared his experience with us on growing premium Pinot Noir and invited us to understand Pinot Noir via terroir. Last year, David Jordan made the parallel between the development of the New Zealand wine industry and Niagara, even challenging us to find our white knight, if you remember. This year, I will let Amy Bowen, a student at Covey, to present the guest speaker. But before that, I would like to introduce Amy to you. Amy holds a Bachelor of Science Honours degree from the University of Guelph in molecular biology and genetics. She started her graduate studies at Brock University in the fall of 2003 under the supervision of Dr. Reynolds, the professor of viticulture at Brock and research scientist at Covey. 2 years later, she transferred to the PhD program in biological sciences, still working with Dr. Reynolds. And her thesis title is a very interesting title to all of us, as you will appreciate. It is the validation of analytical tests for authentication of Canadian ice wine, evaluating the impact of harvest date and crop load on Riesling and Vidal ice wine. You probably already have heard of Amy if you receive regularly Covey media releases. And if you don't, by the way, and would like to do so, just give me your contact details at the break later on, and I will be happy to add your name on the list. Yes, Amy was featured several times in the media release as a recipient of significant awards. Just to name a few, for 3 consecutive years, she was the recipient of the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section Student Scholarship. In 2005, she entered the Wine Tasting Challenge in Toronto and earned the 2nd place in the amateur category. She wanted to know how to grow grapes, and she wants to know how to appreciate wine. That's great. Amy also enrolled in the Sommelier Certificate Program of the Canadian Association of Professional Sommeliers, a program endorsed by the university and delivered at Niagara College. She graduated this summer as a sommelier, and, by the way, finished first of her class. And she earned the prestigious and generous award from the Ontario Austereo Institute. Congrats, Amy. But today you're on duty, Amy, and I would like to invite you to the stage for the privilege to introduce our guest speaker.
Hello and welcome here this evening. It's my job to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker this evening, which is Dianne Davidson, or Di, as she keeps introducing herself to us. So Di has extensive viticultural experience in Australia and abroad. She has worked as a viticulturalist in the Australian wine industry since 1975, starting off as the National Vineyard Managers of Penfold Wineries, or Penfold Wines Limited. Bit of her educational background. She has a Bachelor of Agricultural Science from the University of Adelaide, and then she went on to do a Master's of Science from James Cook University, and then followed that up with a graduate diploma in Business Administration from the South Australian Institute of Technology. In 1987, she established her own consulting firm, Davidson Viticulture Consulting Services, of which she is the managing director. The company provides a full range of services to the grape and wine industry in Australia and abroad. She's worked in such countries as South Africa, Europe, and I found out at dinner tonight, New Zealand, and lunch today, China as well. Currently in Australia, she manages or has consulting input into over 7,000 hectares of Australian vineyards. She's also the owner of director of Davidson Vineyard Management, which provides full vineyard management to over 300 hectares of vineyards in the Langhorne Creek region, as well as technical advice to a further 100 hectares. And she's also the author of 2 books, A Guide to Growing Wine Grapes in Australia and The Business of Vineyards. And if she's not busy enough with all of that, she also owns and operates her own vineyard, where she has 80 hectares of vineyards in the Langhorne Creek region of South Australia, which is where she also lives. It's been a pleasure the past few days to meet and sort of visit with Di, to have her here for the third Triggs Vinifera lecture series. The lecture series not only provides an expert opinion into our industry and a view of sort of what they think we're doing here, but it also provides a forum for grape growers and winemakers in our area to come together and to discuss, share advice and expertise into what does and doesn't work within our area. So by going out into the vineyards and looking at some of the issues and problems, other people can sort of, voice their opinion, and we can all sort of work together as an industry to sort of, work through those. Well, yesterday, I hope, I see some familiar faces, hope many of you participated in our tailgate tour, where we went to 4 different Niagara vineyards, where Dia asked questions and gave suggestions based on what she saw within the vineyards. She addressed many of our concerns, such as dealing with excess vigor, and as well as dealing with labor costs to keep profitability in line in the vineyard. She acknowledged the challenges of growing grapes in Niagara, also admitting, whether she wants to or not now, that she'd never do it, but reminded us that, reminded us of things we can do to keep our vineyards profitable. This morning she spoke at Covey about the economics of growing grapes to a price point, admitting that Australia and Niagara are very different growing regions, but at the same time do share some similarities, such as that we need to keep our vineyards profitable, we need to keep our labor costs down, we need to multitask where available, because the bottom line is we're trying to make money from this business. So I look forward to what she has to say this evening in her talk on cool climate wine grape production, wet price quality, an Australian perspective. So please welcome Dianne Davidson.
Dr. Lightstone, Dr. Leshave, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Amy, for that introduction. Sometimes I wish I just condensed my life to about 2 sentences, which one is that I'm really a very happy wife and mother as well. It seems to be a lot easier thing to describe than the sort of work that I've done over these 30 years, or thereabouts. My objective tonight, and the invitation has been given to me to talk about the price of growing high-quality grapes in cool climates. And I must firstly thank Covey for the opportunity to be here. It is a real honour and privilege to be asked to deliver this Triggs Vinifera lecture, and I do hope that I can give you some ideas. I hasten to say that I don't have all the answers. After all of the years of travelling and working, I have had many experiences, and my philosophy has been over the years to share those experiences, to share the knowledge, and hope that some things resonate with you, and if you just take away one idea, then I'll be quite happy. I don't want to dwell on the Australian industry, but from my limited understanding of the Niagara industry, there are some parallels, and I therefore thought I would give you, I have rewritten a few things in the last couple of days, I should warn you. I would like to give you a broad picture of the Australian industry, first of all, so that you can see the context in which I present my remarks about the challenges of cool climate production. So, as a brief overview, we've been making wine in Australia since 1850. We're not a very old country any more than you are, really, but there is a record of vineyards being planted outside of Sydney in 1790. So that's long before 1850. But the first commercial production dates from about 1850, and we had export success pretty much from that time by exporting as a colonial country to Britain. And in the late 19th century, we did succeed very well in the exhibitions in London. And we continued exporting through the first half of last century with fortified and some red materials until we had the developments with table wines in the 1960s. And although there had been red table wines, the quality did begin to improve in the 1960s. But the particular development was refrigeration technology, which made many other things possible. So our white wine development really commenced in the 60s. Red and white plantings proceeded, mainly in warmer areas of Australia, right through the 60s and the 70s. And it was in the mid-70s that I came into the industry, and I began work in the Barossa Valley area in South Australia. Not long afterwards, probably by about 1983-84, we commenced a vine pool scheme. So right from the beginning of my involvement in the Australian industry, I have seen change. That vine pool was very much directed at removing undesirable or less desired varieties and was subsidised by the government. But there was no plan to go forward. However, in some areas there was the opportunity to start planting Chardonnay. In our very warm areas, inland, and I'll show you a map in a moment, we did get underway with those Chardonnay plantings in the late 1980s, and that's now almost exactly 20 years ago. And at that point, we can say our current boom began. This is the 5th boom cycle in the Australian wine industry. And those of you who work in agriculture will know that agriculture is all about the cycles anyway. But in the Australian wine industry, we have certainly mapped our fortunes, and this is the 5th and the longest and the strongest, as if we need to really have it reinforced, boom development period. And that led, the recognition of that in the early 1990s led to the development of Strategy 2025, which was a document designed as a blueprint to take our industry through the next 30 years. It all seemed a very good idea at the time, and it was a very good idea at the time. Australians are just doers, and they got on with this 30-year project at a pace and a speed which nobody could possibly anticipate. The strategy called for the planting of 40,000 more hectares. We had 50,000 hectares at the time. The strategy called for a further 40,000 hectares over the next 30 years. We planted 50,000 more in 5 years, and thereby hangs everything else. We took to it with zeal, and it did have wonderful spin-offs, and it still is having wonderful spin-offs for regional Australia, which, rather like Canada, I imagine, always welcomes opportunities to develop industries and employment opportunities in far-flung places out of urban surrounds. So off we went. Our 30-year strategy was pretty much in the ground, at least, by 1998, 1999. To do that, however, we did need significant investment, and the federal government made it possible by encouraging investment with tax incentives. We had accelerated depreciation for almost any expenditure associated with new vineyards, and that was one of the prime movers behind this strong growth. Thankfully, though, at the same time, those of us who'd been in the industry for longer understood the need for some real research and development. And in this forum, I would like to reinforce the concept of developing very strong research programs within the industry. Our research programs have been funded by growers and by winemakers, by levies charged on tonnes of grapes grown as well as tonnes processed. And there is a very strong integration between the two sides of the industry. And although there are many areas which have not yet had research focus put upon them, there are many which have really benefited from those levies and the engagement of both parties in the industry. So at least whilst we were getting on with doing things, we were researching how we were doing it simultaneously. Also with that, of course, we had strong sales, very strong sales, particularly into the UK. And this is where our convict past served us well, I think, because it was a fairly sympathetic response to Australians in the UK. But that led to a very urgent demand for fruit. And I'm quite comfortable to say in this forum, because I know a similar thing has happened here from time to time, winemakers did purchase everything they could buy. They were not particularly discriminating about quality or about variety. And many contracts were written for fruit purchase without due consideration to the suitability of the variety in a particular site or a particular region. So all of those things led to overplanting and finally to grape prices which were really too high and unsustainable. And the rest of the story is not unhappy, but I think that background is important because as we face now in Australia a serious supply-demand situation, we need to stop flailing ourselves about it and understand why it happened and to get on and get things right. In the last 5 years, not even as clear up there, I'm afraid, as I hoped it would be. In the last 5 years, we have faced a number of issues, and the grape-growing regions, which may be clearer when we look at this on the website. It's certainly not clear now. But I hope that you can see that all of our regions are close to the coast, and the predominant areas are in southeastern Australia. If you drew a line from the green dot up there in Queensland down to about the middle of the coast of South Australia, which is about 40% of Australia, that region is known as southeastern Australia. And many Australian wines now are labelled with that as their origin, region of origin. Somewhere in the bottom 40% of Australia. That wasn't the plan. And it's something now that we really need to work very hard in developing. In the last 5 years, a number of issues besides the overplanting have worked against us. We've certainly had an unfavourable exchange rate for export. And we've had significant discounting in the overseas markets, particularly in the UK, but also in the US, because those markets were not properly segmented. Not all wines could be sold at our predetermined high price points. Significant competition from the New World, especially Chile, but also South Africa and Argentina, California, Spain, even France, out of the New World, but the New World particularly. New Zealand, of course, has been a significant competitor, but in a very restricted range of wines. So we've given up trying to grow Sauvignon Blanc to compete with them. They can have that opportunity. We'll concentrate on other things. But generally, as an industry, I would say that we were insufficiently prepared for the rapid rate of change which occurred both in the development of the wine industry throughout the globe and for the globalisation of distributor ownership. Supermarkets have taken over, and I don't think that Australian marketers were any more ready for that than American or Spanish or Chilean wine marketers. So there has been a real squeeze on the available channels to market. The distribution channels are owned by very, very few people, and now we have a significant oversupply, and the wine is sitting in Australia unsold. The end of this tale is positive in that we have recognised it's a cyclical industry. We do believe we're near the bottom of the trough, but we are thinking it's 4 to 5 years before we get back into balance. And the lessons from it, and this is something I would hope that you might take away from our history, is that we recognise belatedly that we did not pass market signals back to the growing community. We were so busy doing and so busy growing and selling that we really were too slow to recognise what was happening in the marketplace. We didn't communicate that to wineries, both in terms of wine style, wine pricing, wine opportunities, and we didn't communicate it to growers. And that's why some continued planting right through until 2003. And that happened because essentially as an industry we did not monitor what was happening. We did not keep really good records of vineyard plantings. Even now we do not have a register of all vineyard plantings by variety, by age, by production records in Australia. And further, and here we come to your point, we really did not allow for growth in the cooler areas. When we had Strategy 2025, we said we must include growth and development of vineyards in cooler areas so that we improve the quality of our wine and that we improve the range of, or increase the range of varieties which we can grow. We didn't understand, again, the zeal with which people would take to that task. So we have much more planting in cool areas than we had expected. If you look on the map, that bright yellow area on New South Wales on the right-hand side, the eastern seaboard, with yellow into brown, most of that was not there 10 years ago at all. And much of that is very cool climate. Certainly we don't have snow, but very cool, high spring frost, high winter rainfall areas. And we didn't understand how much of that country would be planted, nor did we allow in the marketing plans to accommodate for the high costs of production. And I would hope that as your industry develops here, that it is understood how quickly things change and how, on the margin, cool climate production really is. So now in Australia we have a great surplus of wine, and much of it is very high quality wine produced in cool areas and at a very high cost of production. Some growers are selling at a loss, as I'll show you. Others are attempting to make wine and sell it themselves and crowding the marketplace further. So there is an upside and a downside to the great success of the Australian industry. We've been too good at what we've tackled, but we've also put our cool climate regions and growers at significant disadvantage, even though they're producing the best fruit in the country. But on that note, I'll move on, because you need to know that the future is very positive, but there's a great deal of planning and refinement to do. And if anything I'm saying tonight assists you in keeping going forward and avoiding some of the issues we've had, then I will have served my purpose in being here. Just very quickly, to show you how cold it gets in Australia, which is not very. And indeed, none of our growing areas would have a temperature below -3 in winter. But a significant area, especially that which is the sort of 9 to 12 degrees pale blue area, and cooler, suffers spring frosts. And they are much more our concern than winter frosts. And of course, we don't experience winter kill at all. So we're not a cold country, but we certainly have areas which are very cool. And if you remember the former map, most of the grape growing is going on down here in the southeastern bottom right-hand corner. And again, another way of showing you that, the total bearing area in these cooler areas is about 160,000 hectares, which is, the total area overall. The total planted area is 40,000 hectares for cool climates, and that's about 16%. However, that area produces a very large proportion of our wine. And for comparison, again, the same map showing it under the regional classification, the heat degree days. So we don't actually have many very cool regions. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll touch upon climate change. But while this map is up here, you might like to note that Tasmania down here, which is a state of Australia, it's not a separate island, is currently growing very good quality sparkling, Chardonnay for sparkling. We anticipate that after we've had full climate change, it might be the only place in Australia to grow anything. And it's very small and very mountainous. We're a hot country, so cool climates are scarce and no easier to deal with than yours. I don't need to tell you that there is very small error margin in grape production. Professor Andy Reynolds said this evening that there are more potential adversaries in Niagara than in any grape growing region of the world, and I would suggest he's right after my brief look at it this week. And certainly there are many challenges to you, but there are also challenges to anybody who takes on wine grape production in a cool to cold area. There are challenges to the viticulture, there's challenges to the winemaking, and particularly there are financial challenges. There are difficulties in obtaining consistent cropping levels for the health of the vine. There are difficulties in obtaining consistent returns to growers. Growers cannot stay in business if they are cropping very inconsistently from year to year. And I fully understand that that might occur in this environment with the winter freeze conditions. However, anything that can be done to alter that and even out the troughs is of benefit for sustainable viticulture. There are difficulties in obtaining consistent fruit quality because as you replace vines after a winter kill or after a spring frost, you have fruit cropping on young wood, old wood, young vines, mature vines. And if there's one thing winemakers do not appreciate, it's variable fruit quality and non-uniformity in a vineyard. But it's very common in our cool environments. There's difficulties in obtaining consistent volumes. So from a marketing point of view, you cannot be certain of having the same quantity of fruit available, of wine available year after year. Probably even worse than that is the difficulty in ensuring consistent wine quality year after year. And they're the challenges to the winemaker and to the marketer. But the challenges to the grape grower at the beginning point of that value chain are very significant. So we understand that there is no margin for error, and we have to try to get it right from the beginning. I'm certain that most of you will have heard of and maybe drunk and hopefully enjoyed Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. Well, that's an example of it, out of control, and an example of one of the things that we did not do very well in Australia in the 90s in terms of choosing planting sites. And that's something which I'm conscious can occur here as well on your very variable soils. You have a mosaic of soil types geologically, and that does make it difficult and a challenge to find the right variety for the right site. Coonawarra Cabernet, grown on traditional, typical Coonawarra Terra Rossa, is a nice tidy vine with shoots that do not need trimming. The whole vine behaves itself in crops of a pleasant 3 to 4 tonnes to the acre at maximum. However, Coonawarra has a lot of black soil in its area as well, black, deep cracking clays, and that's this particular photograph. The fruit does not resemble Coonawarra Cabernet, the good Coonawarra Cabernet. However, it is at this moment still going into wines which are labelled as such and definitely hurting the image of the region and the variety. It's just one example where a long-held picture and history of excellent quality is being spoiled by incorrect site variety choice. And I think there are many situations in which that affects the sustainability and the profitability of a vineyard business. So that's the first big challenge, getting the right variety in the right site and on the right soil type. Now, I barely need to tell you that there are climatic factors at work in cool climates. And that's a brief summary of them, but I'm sure we could all add a few more. But in my experience, because I do not have the winter kill misfortune, the impact of most of these factors is on fruit set. It's due to spring weather. And that might be wind, and it might be heavy rain, and it might be wildly fluctuating temperatures. And poor fruit set means poor cropping levels, poor income to the grower, mixed quality to the winemaker, and reduced quantities of fruit. So the major impact in Australia is on fruit set. There's certainly an impact from wet springs on vigor management, and when we do have wet springs in hilly areas where the soils tend to be heavier, we find that we have out-of-control vines and out-of-balance vines. And the third major impact, and the one which we are feeling most in the industry now, is in ripening red varieties well. When we set about our grand planting plan last decade, and as it turns out, last century, we did not allow sufficiently, mainly through our inexperience and our ability to get on and do things, for the fact that vines in cool climates actually crop more heavily in many cases than in temperate climates. So in a situation like this photograph, which is in the Adelaide Hills, we could easily be growing Cabernet Sauvignon at 10, 12, 15 tonnes to the hectare, or Shiraz. In order for it to ripen, we need to crop it at no more than 8. So the growers who did all of their planning and budgeting on high yields are finding that halving the yields, but not increasing the price, is not the situation or the scenario which they expected. So depending where you are and at what time of the year that climatic factor has its impact, there is a serious impact on your business. The last item, the cloud cover, I think it's the same here as it is in our cooler Australian areas where autumn or fall comes in early, sunshine reduces. You may have consistent cloud cover. In our case, it's more fogs, thick clouds that come over our cooler areas and sit day and night. We can get Indian summers, as you do too, but more often than not, they're too late to be of use. We can't hang on that long. We get heavy rains usually in autumn, so if we can't ripen quickly, it's all over. So very low yields for red varieties are essential. Finding the balance in this business of growing grapes in cool climates is a major challenge, I think. It's a financial balance and it's a viticultural balance. Getting the right crop load is essential, not only for ripening red varieties, as I've just discussed, but there are dangers in overcropping, dangers in early cropping, trying to chase a crop in the second leaf in order to get an early return on the investment in order to repay debt. That's a mistake because the vine is usually overworked and possibly exhausted in its early years. Crop load is really important to consider for fruit quality and for sustainable long-term and consistent production. The best fruit comes from very well-balanced vines, and very well-balanced vines have been nurtured from the beginning in a very consistent fashion and given the best possible care. So getting that viticultural balance right at the beginning is extremely important. And the financial balance is no less easy. Because high quality, whatever that really means, nearly always means higher costs. But we all know that not everything in a vineyard, whatever the vineyard is doing, is of the same quality, nor is it likely that it can be used for the same quality wine. And therefore it's really important to segment the vineyard and be realistic about its capabilities with respect to fruit quality. I've not yet seen a vineyard anywhere with more than perhaps 1 hectare at a time of really consistent quality fruit and wine. So the financial implications of taking on grape growing in a cool climate are many and varied. And I'll come back to that. But another major challenge in getting this balance right and spending the right amount of money to obtain the right returns is using the appropriate viticultural practices. And again, I'm as much talking about the future as the past here. There will be new plantings, there will be different plantings, there will be replantings. And if we can only learn from what we've done in the past, particularly that vineyards are not uniform, then we've done ourselves a favour. Selection of the very best sites is absolutely critical. There should be no halfway measures. Good enough is, or near enough is not good enough. It's a very expensive business running a vineyard, let alone making wine. And in order to get the best return and the most satisfaction from it, you need to select the very best site. And in a cool climate, that means warm or relatively warm and well-drained soils. Warmer for the aspect as well, In this climate, of course, we need a southerly facing slope, but I'm thinking, well, it's very flat around here, but nonetheless there are well-drained soils, and the opportunities they have to warm up, some will do that faster and better than others. We need to have a site that maximises sunlight interception both on the soil and on the vines themselves, and therefore on the fruit. We need to use practices that manage the vigour, and we talked about that a lot yesterday going around on the tailgate tour. Not all vines are the same, not all varieties are the same. Suitable trellising and vine training is important. Not all varieties should be trained the same way, even on the same soil type. There are many, many combinations. And it's important to find what is right for your site and then use the appropriate practice to make it work. Generally speaking, relatively low crops are appropriate. And I've been encouraged to hear, whilst in Niagara, that from 7 to 10 tonnes to the hectare is what most people are achieving, even though they may be growing more than that. But again, you need to develop a pruning technique and a canopy management technique that allows for the least costly production of a low crop. Growing a lot of grapes and then picking them and throwing them on the ground because there are too many is both wasteful and discouraging, and we need to improve our viticultural practices such that we get the vine in balance early and grow the crop level which we want. And certainly this week, every vineyard I've been in has been through a crop thinning process once or twice. And that's something now that we are doing in Australia, although we were very resistant to it. But we have changed our ways. I would think the last 3 to 4 years we do a lot more of it, but it is a very discouraging and dispiriting activity to undertake. So if we can develop better management practices and better balance in our vines, perhaps by altering planting distances, certainly by choosing better rootstocks or more appropriate rootstocks, so that we grow what we want from the beginning. There's pages of challenges, you see. And I wonder why we do it. That's what we were saying earlier this evening. Why do we even bother? It's because we all wish to not only enjoy the fruits of our labours, but because it is a challenge to achieve something special. So the next set of challenges is really in the financial implications. And production costs in this area, I am told, by a number of people, range between about $8,000 to $10,000 Canadian per hectare. In Australia, that doesn't convert. In Australia, our equivalent costs are about $12,000 to $18,000 a hectare in cool climates. The difference is primarily the cost of labour, and labour is our biggest input. In most of our areas in Australia, cool climate production uses about 60% of its direct costs in labour. Sometimes it might be to 70%, because that long list of activities there all relies on people. This photograph I put in particularly to show you that there are so many wires in that particular vineyard, all of which must be lifted by people. The cost of doing that is outrageous. And I suggest in that particular case that it probably does not return as the grower would hope it would. It's a Nebbiolo vineyard, actually, in the Adelaide Hills, designed to imitate something in northern Italy. But the cost of doing it is huge for this grower. So 60% of labour goes in, 60% of the direct cost goes into direct labour. In our warmer climates, our competitors in the Australian wine market, we're looking at perhaps 25 to 30% of direct cost being labour. A huge difference. So we spend a lot of time now managing that labour, and as we talked about this morning in our seminar here at the university, the major change we've made in the last few years is forcing supervision on labour, really ensuring that the labour, which mostly now works as piecework, is thoroughly supervised, carefully supervised, and that has meant significant savings for us. And from my discussions with a few people here, that may be an area where savings can be made. There is nothing to be gained and all to be lost by pointing vineyard workers in the general direction of the vineyard with a go and do this task. When I asked somebody yesterday what the instruction was for removing bunches, how to get down to one bunch per shoot, and the answer was, tell them I want one bunch per shoot. There was a lot of thinking going on with that, with casual workers. So the supervision of such tasks and the reinforcement of the task to be done can save huge dollars. Just to talk about the grape price issue for the moment, it's an example of what has happened to Australian wine grape prices over the years. And you can see that things aren't looking too bright for the next 3 years either. In our cool climates, we are now very much at break even, and even indeed at a loss point. Because at the end of each boom in our vineyard development in Australia, there has been a long plateau of low prices and a significant decline. And we know that we're going to be down at that level. That's a very realistic forecast. And it is simply the result of supply and demand. The challenge for cool climates now is to find a price which enables growers to stay in business. A price which reflects the cost of production and the need for a sensible and sustainable profit to be made so that the grower can reinvest and the business can grow. And too many growers, I suggest around the world, see growing as a lifestyle and not as a business, that are not really recognise the need to make a profit and a sufficient profit to reinvest. And in this situation here with winter kill and frequent replanting, that profit is very, very important. So our challenge now in Australia, and I suggest it will come to you too as you plant more vineyard and produce more wine, you'll need to manage that development very carefully, not to fall into this same situation where prices are barely adequate for a grower to break even. As an example from my own vineyards, I'm being paid at the moment for my red grapes $650 a tonne Australian, so that's whatever, 400 Canadian, thereabouts, 500 Canadian. 3 years ago, it was 3 times that price. And over those 3 years, the quality has improved, not deteriorated. And that is a typical situation responding precisely to the market signal. So managing the price fall when it comes, and it will come, is something that you need to watch for in this industry. And the Australian experience was that we got very carried away in the 90s, paying prices which were too high. We didn't need those good times. They were terrific, but we didn't need them. And we are very much now paying the price for the opportunity to do so well. So again, my message is to be very careful with grape pricing. Don't push it out to a point that is not sustainable, because the damage and the fallout from harsh times will be much greater than you would like it to be. So confronted with these situations, we are now in our industry focusing on many business management strategies. I mentioned our research and development earlier, and that has been very strong and very positive. However, it has not, until the last couple of years, allowed for much education on anything viticultural and winemaking matters. The transfer of information from research out into the growing and the winemaking communities has been very effective and effectively carried out through a number of institutions and government and grower-funded bodies. However, most growers and wine growers really do not recognise that their vineyard is a business. So now we are having to undertake significant training and put a lot of effort into teaching people to think about their business, their vineyard as a business. And as part of that, we need to develop excellent on-site management. In particular, we are training wine growers and the managers of vineyards as well as the owners of vineyards, firstly, to focus on profitability. Profit, profit, profit. It is not a dirty word. Without it, there is no business, there is no employment, there is no product. And that focus, of course, has a great emphasis on cost management. And labour management particularly, but also the costs of materials and machinery and all items that go into producing the crop. The second area of training is encouraging growers to understand the business, the vineyard, and its capabilities very well, and thereby having a realistic expectation of its performance. If it can only produce 7 tonnes to the hectare, well, that's it. Do not budget for 10. Have a realistic grape price. What is a realistic grape price? Based on your experience or on your relationship and knowledge of the winemaker's requirements. But being very realistic about the capabilities of the vineyard is something that many people find very difficult. They have a vineyard and it works. Don't ask for the detail. Well, it's time to understand the detail. Third area of training in business management is to teach people to foster and nurture a strong relationship with the wine grape buyer. We've realised, not too late, but belatedly, that there must be a strong engagement between the parties in recognising the mutual need of each party. And it must be a sustainable business for both into the future. It's very easy in Australia at the moment, and I guess it's very easy in any situation where a grower is feeling aggrieved about pricing or quality gradings. It's very easy to damn the grape buyer and say, well, we're not having any more to do with you. We do not have that luxury in Australia. Many of our growers are now either out of contract or about to be out of contract. And so nurturing that relationship has become a matter of prime importance. Lots of cups of tea, lots of scones, lots of good times, take me out to lunch, but mostly come and visit and understand my business. Understand what I as a grower am going through, what it costs me, what I have to do to meet your quality standards. And in setting the grape price, it is essential that winemakers really understand the workings of the vineyard. Otherwise, those misunderstandings translate not only into inappropriate grape prices, but a lack of concern for the long-term sustainability of the vineyard business. Next area of this business management training is the promotion of the appropriate viticultural practices, as I said before, so that everybody understands the intended end use and the realistic price point for the wine, so that we're not spending money growing something that we're never going to sell. I used an example today of a vineyard I'm working with in Victoria, where the intent of the owners is to produce wine that sells only above $20 a bottle. It's fortunate to sell quite a bit of its product at about $40 to $50 a bottle, but it's also selling a significant proportion at about $15. But its approach is the same across the entire vineyard. It's extremely expensive. Everything is tended and cared for to within an inch of its life. The vines look wonderful. Almost 75% of their direct costs are spent on labour. But they are not getting it back in the bottle price. And what they need to do is identify which blocks are going to go into the expensive wine, or most likely to, which aren't, and adopt the appropriate viticultural practice. And that, strangely, and it seems to be very obvious, but it's not how we've thought in the past. Again, there's a vineyard there, you treat it all the same way, get over it all, do the whole vineyard in the same way. It's a very expensive way to go about things. Another area of training in business management is risk assessment. Encouraging and really teaching growers and managers to identify all of the risks in their business. It's easy to identify winter freeze as a risk here, but there's lots of risks. There are many risks, beginning with the quality of the planting material you use, the health of the planting material, the quality of the labour you use, the likelihood of a very early very cold winter, spring in the early years of the vine's life. There's the risk of disease. There's the risk of a range of poor climatic issues. There's the risk of finance, the risk of a winery not buying the fruit. There's pages and pages of risks. And slowly we are getting people to write them all down and have a risk management schedule just as any other business has. So there's a contingency plan for all of these things as they happen and a prioritising of risk so that when times get really bad, it's an easier decision-making process to decide what you can or should do. And lastly, in this focused business management training is the need to understand the management of the environment and natural resources. Around the world, we're all much more conscious of this issue. The Australian wine industry has now a stewardship program directed particularly at all producers of wine grapes to ensure that we can document and prove that we are treating the environment and our natural resources both responsibly and carefully, and that we are regenerating many of them, particularly natural vegetation and water resources. And that stewardship program is very active and has become more so since recent visits from the supermarket buyers in the UK actually wishing to inspect how we produce our grapes and wanting to see where we keep the wedge-tailed eagles and wanting to see how we handle our wastewater. They're very real pressures, so we are responding to them as best we can, but you have to start by training the managers. And in terms of the most important thing about managing a vineyard well is that the on-site management has to be first class. There's just no room for second-grade management. It has to be accountable and has to understand the ins and outs of the entire business. In particular, it needs to understand cash management as well, because people need to be paid cash, and in cool climates where we're so dependent upon labour, they need cash. And cash brings more businesses undone in the wine industry than almost any other thing, or lack of availability of cash. So our challenges going forward, I guess the first one is to stay in business. That's not listed there, but it should be. But our viticultural strategies are, firstly, better site selection. We unashamedly acknowledge that we have all varieties planted in all regions on all soil types. And that's simply not the way to go. Those of us closely associated with winemakers over many years know that we produce our best wine from varieties in the best location. So as you see changes going forward in the Australian industry, you'll certainly see removal of some vineyards, some replanting, but definitely much better site selection. We will also use more rootstocks, and this is something that you do as a matter of course. In Australia, we are fortunate to have very little phylloxera. It's located in just 3 or 4 regions in Victoria in the southeastern corner of the country. And we have used rootstocks for phylloxera resistance there, but there's a number of rootstocks in use now for salinity tolerance, for acid soil tolerance, for drought tolerance, for wet soil tolerance. And it's now becoming part of the course in Australia. It'll be a long time before 100% of our country's vineyards are planted to rootstock, but I'm encouraged by the knowledge we've gained, certainly a great deal of it from recent research in the last 15 years. And I'm sure that as we replant and move on into the next decade, we will be using rootstocks to much greater advantage, and particularly directed to balancing the vine's vigour and balancing the vine's capacity so that we are growing both the crop load we want for the quality we want. And the research that we are doing is very much directed towards that area now, rather than where we've been for the past few years in just best viticultural practice. We're now focusing very much on how the vine operates in each different location. So the last part of that replanting and going forward planting scenario is that we will be using better quality planting material as well. The great rush of the 1990s meant that anything much was planted. We cannot import easily into Australia, so we have produced all of our own planting material, most of it. To import anything is 6 cuttings at a time, which then sit in quarantine for 2 years, so it's not a rapid way to get started. But many wine companies have been slowly building up their stocks of different clones and different varieties over the last 20 years. So when we go into our next phase of the industry, perhaps that's after 2010 or 2012, we will start to see a lot of this better quality material and disease-free material go into the new vineyards. We do have quite a lot of leaf roll virus in our older vineyards, but we've had a very active program for removal of virus from much of our planting material in the last 10 years. So whilst we do not look like South Africa, where it looks wonderful in autumn for all the wrong reasons, very colourful, whilst we're not nearly as bad as that, we do have planting material that is infected much more than we would like. So these issues are all more important than ever in cool climates, getting that site selection right. And I believe that we will see a number of vineyards moved, not so much abandoned as moved within a property or up a slope, rarely down a slope, but up a slope away from frost-prone areas and wet areas and the like. But I'm certain that we will see greater use of rootstocks and a range of rootstocks for a range of purposes. And lastly, climate change is on the way. And that is information from our government Bureau of Meteorology that has now got us all thinking as if we don't have enough challenges at the moment trying to work out how to survive and how to stay in business. Life is changing around us. And I know that nothing is certain about climate change, but we've had very innovating discussions in recent times in the industry about how we're going to adapt to climate change. Whatever scale it's going to be, it's going to happen. And we can't adapt overnight. We need to think about it and plan for it. And those discussions are having very useful spin-offs. And I share it with you because it is something that's occupying us greatly, and I suggest that it will also occupy your minds. It probably is right now. But if the scenario of 1.4 to 2 degrees in the next 20 years comes to fruition, we will find that our only cool climate areas will be down there in Tasmania or just around Melbourne, in Victoria, in the southeastern corner. And those of us north of that point, who are currently cool climate or temperate, will find that we are having to grow our vines and vineyards very differently. And we need to start planning now for what varieties we want to grow. Are we going to persist with Shiraz when we're effectively in a very hot situation? Or are we going to grow something else? Are we going to still try to produce whites, cool climate whites, in what will then be a warm to hot region? We're already seeing changes in central New South Wales with temperature increases and rainfall decrease. So as part of the planning going forward, thinking about cool climates not only as how to cope with them, but where are they going to be? Trying to predict the future, trying to hedge the bets. There are certainly winemakers now who are purchasing land to plant in areas further south than where they currently are. So I suggest we're taking it very seriously, and I'm sure when you are thinking about it yourselves, you've had other issues such as increased humidity along with an increased temperature, and you might welcome a lower likelihood of a winter freeze or a spring frost. But if high humidity brings higher pest and disease issues, it's a cleft stick, isn't it? But it is something that we are looking at and planning for with no great certainty. But generally we're saying, well, perhaps we need 5 years to get our mind around it, start planning, and then start implementing these adaptations in 5 years' time. Water supply in Australia is critical, and of all the things that will happen to us, water availability, or lack of, will be the most serious. Those of you who visited will know how infrequently you see a river, let alone one with water in. It's usually a dry creek bed. And our one big precious river, the Murray, which runs through Victoria and South Australia, already is struggling with salinity issues and overuse. And one of the scenarios, of course, with the higher temperatures for us is more bushfires. More bushfires mean more regrowth of forest, and regrowth of forest uses more water and prevents water table recharge. And that means less water in our rivers again. So we can frighten ourselves silly when we think too closely about it, but it is worth the thinking, because on top of everything else, if our business is high quality wine grape production, preferably in a cool climate, then we need to be ready to adapt to the change. So life in Australia's cool climates is nothing if not interesting. It could be depressing. It's not. It's just extremely challenging. But I hasten to say that growing grapes here, I think, is probably the biggest challenge of anywhere I've seen in the world. And that includes my time in Maharashtra State in India in March this year, where I selected 2 vineyard sites with some confidence, but with great concern about how they'll manage with monsoons and dry seasons. I think the challenges in this site are much greater, and you are to be congratulated on producing the superb quality that you do from the conditions that you face from time to time. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that 1 or 2 ideas might resonate, and I'm very happy to talk to any of you throughout the evening. Thank you. The question is about selection of appropriate trellising for a site and a variety. If I direct it perhaps to Niagara, where the importance of fruit exposure and aeration of fruit and canopy is really important, there are several options, as there are options in any cool areas, but I think you need to look at what works well on your site in terms of soil type, in terms of the variety itself, and of the labour available to you. I know that there's a great deal of Scott Henry vine training through the area here, and that is a very good system in some situations. It's not appropriate to all, and it will depend on your ability to employ labour efficiently in managing. It's a very expensive system. If you don't have ready access to labour, you can't supervise labour. You need to look at other options, be they a vertically shoot position system, which has its own share of labour cost, of course, but it is less intensive. The number of wires, the number of posts required to support the variety that you're growing on the soil type with the degree of exposure, all comes into the equation. If you are growing fruit that is never likely to be super premium or very high priced, you do not want to use a trellis that's going to have a very high maintenance to it. And a high maintenance trellis is one with a lot of wires. The posts or the steels or timber posts which you use need to be very long lived so that you can keep that maintenance cost down. And the number of wires vertically is, you need to choose between having many there more or less permanently or fewer which are moved throughout the season. It depends on the variety, whether they're more naturally vertically inclined or whether they're floppy, such as Merlot, which really defies all attempts to stand up, and probably Traminer as well, the Vert Traminer. But many other varieties stand quite obligingly, and the proper balance within the vine, so that we're, again, I would come back to suggesting you space it more widely so that each vine works a little harder and it will grow fewer but stronger shoots, which will be inclined to be more vertical, will help you with a simpler trellising and vine training form. But close spacing of varieties on good root or strong rootstock encourages high vigour, rather sappy growth, sprawling vines, more trellis, more wires, and the whole thing spirals. So it's a matter of starting at the beginning with a trellis plan and keeping it as simple as you possibly can, and therefore as cheap as you possibly can. Is that helpful? There's no one answer. Difficult question to condense, but essentially it was about the lifetime of a vineyard, if I can put it as simply as that. We would think we have thought in the past in 25-year cycles. In terms of financially, if all goes well and the situation is relatively straightforward, break-even will have occurred by about year 10. It might occur in year 6 in the very warm and easier areas, but say year 10, year 11. It's a financial break-even. Our trellising systems tend to last about 15 to 20, and the vines seem to hit their most mature and heaviest cropping levels around about 20 to 25. After 20, they start to taper off. But like California, we have vines which are now 130, 140 years old, very few of them, and they're all in our warm areas or hot areas, not in our cooler areas. With the tax incentives that I mentioned before, which were brought in and have now thankfully been discontinued, but we did have them for 10 years, with those incentives that were brought in 95, the government worked on a 20-year program for taxation purposes, and 20 years for the lifetime of the vineyard. So I would think that now, with looking at change, climate change coming and new planning, we would be inclined to take a slightly shorter term view, but it probably would never be less than 20. But you know, some of the very best wines, and you do know that some of the very best wines come from some very old vines, but only if they're in good health. You know, just being old doesn't make them high quality, and I think that we do have a number of vineyards which could and should have been pulled out last decade, but weren't because of the requirement for fruit, and they have stayed on in our national inventory and could well and truly come out now, and they'd be amongst the first to be removed in the current conditions. The government assisted the wine industry with its irrigation developments. No, not in any particular way. Irrigation in Australia of any agricultural enterprise has always attracted a 3-year depreciation for some parts of the system and 10 years for some other parts of the system. And that includes dams, channels, pumps and then infield systems. That has been the case, well, forever, let's say for 25, 30, 40 years. Because of our need for water, irrigation has always had a high priority. With the new tax incentives brought in 1995, some of that depreciation that had been previously allowed over 3 years was brought in to 1 year. And that would be the only, it wasn't specifically directed towards assisting with irrigation, it was directed towards assisting with all costs associated with new vineyard establishment. So all the money spent could be written off in 1 year. That has all now been removed, and no, the industry has had no special treatment with irrigation at all. We've certainly spent a great deal of research monies on irrigation. I should know, but I don't, the percentage of viticultural research funds, but it's been a very large percentage on water management, irrigation scheduling, and natural resource management, because we have an increasing issue with salinity and lack of availability. So there's been a lot of work done, and a great deal, 80% of our production occurs in warmer areas. The Greek is all occurring in cooler areas. So the huge volume of fruit which is produced in our warmer areas all consumes quite considerable quantities of water. But as an example of the benefits of that research, I guess in 1990, in those warm area vineyards, the average consumption of water for, say, a 20 tonnes per hectare crop, and that's a maximum, let's say 15 tonnes per hectare crop, that might have been 10 megalitres per hectare, somewhere between 7 and 10 megalitres per hectare. That has come down now, 15 years later, to about 4 megalitres per hectare, just through improved practices and an awareness by growers of waste and proper management. Does that answer your question? It's about nutrition and how we make our decisions. Are they based on soil type and soil testing? We are, as growers, we are very aware of nutritional requirements, and we generally all use PTOL analysis and regular soil testing to guide fertilising decisions. But I would say that most fertilising is done in the first 2 years of a vineyard's life, and then very little thereafter. Our soils are very old, and they are, apart from the warm areas, our cool areas are generally heavier soils with relatively high clay content and therefore good retention capability. And there are times when nitrogen might be applied after harvest, but rarely at the beginning of the season. And in the higher rainfall areas, there may be a potassium requirement. But generally speaking, we use very little in the way of fertilisers after about the second or third year, with the exception of folio applications of micronutrients or trace elements. We have a chronic deficiency across the countryside of zinc and manganese, so we tend to put that in with every fungicide spray. And we do have some areas which require boron on a regular basis, every year basis. And most Merlot growers use molybdenum to improve fruit set. But in terms of NPK, not very much at all, but always guided by soil tests, and more particularly by PTOL analyses. So that we try to get growers and our clients to test PTOLs every year, but soil perhaps every 3 years. We've also become very good at large-scale soil surveys across the country. We dig pits a metre deep and analyse the soil profile very thoroughly. So we like to think we understand our soils quite well, probably not as well as you do here. But then again, I might be wrong about that, but I've heard a lot about soil while I'm here. But it really doesn't matter how much the region knows or the district knows, it's about what each person knows about their own site. And that's what I was referring to before about knowing a vineyard's capabilities. Is going to be an expensive vineyard to maintain? Will it need ongoing feeding and ongoing soil structure development, or is it reasonably stable and sustainable? So yeah, we're very aware of it and very sensitive to it. I would add that we rarely take advice from suppliers of chemicals or fertilisers. We have, over the years, of course, all of the manufacturers of fertilisers offer PTOL testing advice. We try to get as many people as possible to use independent advice to analyse and then make recommendations on applications, because, and the same really applies to fungicides as well. We really do try to cut out the suppliers from the whole argument, so that growers are making decisions on a real as-needs basis, on an affordable basis. please try to sell some more wine. So the people doing the selling and the marketing are working overtime. Grape prices cannot fall any lower, but they simply can't. Now, they will in places, but generally speaking, they cannot without causing severe harm to the supply side of the industry. And at long last, we do have the wineries recognising that issue. So hopefully we can stop that problem getting worse. One suggestion that we're discussing, but which is probably, as I said this morning, Buckley's chance of working, but it is worth considering, is having every vineyard not produce, or produce 10% less in the coming year. So crop at normal levels, but just not harvest 10%, so that we remove that from the equation. And no, and we're not seeking any government help. We had the government-funded vine pool back in the 1980s, and that was very helpful to give us a clean sheet to get started. There are certainly growers in Australia who are calling for government assistance. Most of us view is that we did create this situation ourselves, unwittingly, and without sufficient planning and thought, and we need to undo it ourselves. But the most important thing that we're trying to work on is this engagement between wine companies and growers, so we share the pain. Now, if we can't sell all that wine, we may well be looking at putting more grapes on the ground and maybe not selling all the wine, just disposing of it. But of course, there are huge financial losses and considerations. But pain is being felt. Now, from a grower's point of view, those who have no contracts at all and have no immediate prospect of selling fruit for the next 2 or 3 years, some of them are considering mothballing vineyards, which is a terrible word, and it really doesn't mean anything except reducing all of the inputs into a vineyard. The most important thing about that process is keeping the vine healthy. And to keep the vine healthy so that it can come back to work means pruning, very hard, very, not carefully, but still pruning it. It means maintaining its health with pest and disease management. It means harvesting it, dropping it on the ground. You don't get away with much. You still need to put on copper and sulphur, for example, to keep the worst of diseases at bay. And my assessment at the moment is that it probably will cost at least 50% of normal operations to do that, so it's still money going out. So the growers who are doing that are firmly hoping, as opposed to firmly believing, that their vineyard will be attractive, or the product of their vineyard will be attractive to wineries when the times change. My concern, my very real concern, is that there will be so much fruit available to wine companies once the times change, or grape buyers, that coming back to these vineyards which have been left half abandoned will be an unattractive option. They won't need to do that. There will be plenty of good product still on the market with those people who've had the financial resources just to keep plugging along and every year drop it on the ground and not harvest it. There are others who are taking the opportunity to replant a vineyard and maybe move south at the same time, but certainly replant. There are some who are grafting, but in our experience, grafting is not a waste of time, but it's a very difficult operation to achieve very good success in. Almost nobody I know over many years has had 100% success rate in grafting, and it might take 3 years to get back to having a uniform vineyard with uniform fruit quality, and very labour intensive and high cost and high risk. So in terms of changing a variety, I would always go down the replant path. We have people who have developed equipment for removing vines without removing the trellis, side-mounted diggers and pullers, even something that purports to cut the cordons off the wire without damaging the wire. I don't think that's worth the effort. The wire's got so many nicks and scratches that it's got to come out anyway. But again, it's testing our inventiveness. But there will be growers who will simply walk away. But at the same time, and lastly, there are buyers in any market. And some of these vineyards are actually being purchased at very low prices by groups of people and property trusts which can afford to hold them with no income, hold them and operate them with no income for a few years in the hope that times will come good. So there's a number of things happening, but it is very difficult to... We're not getting any market signals back to the growing community about the future. So we're tending to have to make our own decisions in a bit of a vacuum. All we know is that we have too much wine. The question was about China's influence on the global wine industry. Yes, I do see significant change, and I know that others here have been and seen what's happening in China. And I think the rule is with China is you only hear and see half the story. Things are always more than what you believe anyway. When I was there late last year, I was only on the Shandong Peninsula, the bit of country that points out towards Korea. It is covered in new vineyards. Many of them look just like Australian vineyards. Scott Henry, Smart Dyson, more disease than any of us would like to see here, but they'll get used to that. There are people from all over the world, particularly Australia, working there for the experience, short-term experience. Their wines are increasingly New World type, New World style wines. And I was reading an article recently, and I've now forgotten the numbers, but there are huge plantings. There's millions of hectares. So what that means, I'm not sure. It certainly has meant for Australia that any hopes we might have had of infiltrating China eventually, we will still do that with some wines, but they're not going to take our oversupply. They're not interested in that, although some of it is going there at the moment at very low cost, well below production costs. But I think China will become the biggest producer in the world of wine of a range of quality. Like Australia, and unlike Canada, it has a huge range of environments in which to grow grapes. It doesn't have to choose all the most difficult. And whether or not all of the Chinese people decide to take to wine instead of spirit and beer is a bit beside the point. If they make so much, they will be exporting. And we will have a global industry with a lot more wine at the full range of qualities than we have at the moment. So I think we just have to get on with what we do well and make sure that we understand that not any one country can expect to grow only top quality wine. We all grow a full range of wine and a full range of qualities and gradings, and we need to do what we do to the very best of our ability. But I don't think we can deny that a country like China just makes things happen. I was asked to design a vineyard, Australian style, but in the end, I hasten to assure you, I didn't actually. I made comments on the site and left, and I haven't been invited back. So I'm not responsible at the minute. But in the design, it was, yes, well, we want one that looks like Australian and where the vines are spaced like this and other, but no machine harvesting. And in this particular area, there is significant summer rainfall. And I pointed out that machine harvesting is something that one should allow for, or at least design for, because it's very handy to be able to pick in a hurry before or straight after rain, and you can certainly pick in the cool of the evening. And I was very quickly told that, well, that might be the case, but we have so much labour that the rains will just go down the road and get another 100 people. And, I mean, that is the China story, isn't it? So, I think watch this space, but everything you read about it, I suggest, is true, and probably much more than we read about it.